Hey, world history students, second video on the Crusades. When we left off in the last video, we had seen that what would eventually be called the First Crusades had happened, and from a European point of view, it seemed rather successful. They were able to take back much of the Holy Land from Muslim rule. And the Byzantine Empire was able to take back a significant chunk of the Anatolian Peninsula from the Seljuk Turks, who were also Muslim. And over the next few decades, European rule over the Holy Land gets consolidated. And if we zoom in, we can see a version of what that looked like. These are called Crusader states. If you're looking at this larger map here, this is the area I'm looking at, the Holy Land, right here on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. So that right here, Jerusalem, okay? So these different colors here are known as Crusader states. So when the Crusaders, being urged by the Pope in the West, or the Roman Catholic Church or the Latin Church, the idea was that these Crusaders would go to the Holy Land and take back territory from the Turks, because Emperor Alexios of the Byzantine Empire called Pope Urban II and needed some help. So what happened was, instead of giving this land back to the Byzantine Empire, the Western Crusaders just kept it for themselves, and they set up what are called Crusader states or Crusader kingdoms. I find that to be pretty interesting. So on our timeline here, we are at well, I'm sorry, I've seemed to lose my train of thought here. Let's see, we're about here. As we get to the middle of the 12th century, 1150, we do have Muslims that begin to take back some territory, in particular Edessa and Aleppo. And this spawns what's known as the Second Crusade. This dot on the left here is the First Crusade. This dot here represents the Second Crusade. And as you see dots come onto the timeline, those are going to indicate successive crusades. There are some crusades that are unnumbered, and there are some crusades that come under other names, and we'll talk about that later in this video. So the Second Crusade is right here. And third, fourth, fifth, sixth, this year, a crusade happened here, but it wasn't numbered. It was called the Barons' Crusade. 7th, 8th, and there was a 9th crusade. That happened later. What happened right around the time of the Second Crusade, a sultan named Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, came, and he was able to take Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land back and put it into Muslim rule. And this really strikes a chord with the West, because here they had these Crusader kingdoms that they had been ruling for quite a long time. I mean, look at this 90-year stretch right here. That was under Christian rule, basically Western European rule. And now Saladin takes it back, and it's in Muslim control, and it spawns another crusade, the Third Crusade, right here. And the Third Crusade does make some gains, and it gets a lot of buy-in from Western Europe, especially the kings of Western Europe. You have King Philippe II of France. He gets involved. Richard I also known as Richard the Lionheart of England. He gets involved. And then you have the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. He also gets involved. And when I say Holy Roman Empire, I'm thinking of the Germanic Empire. We have German popes at this time. So what I really want you to think is medieval Germany. All right, so these Crusaders are moving together, trying to get to the Holy Land, and it turns out that Frederick Barbarossa ends up drowning in a river. A lot of his Germanic soldiers are dispirited and they turn back. King Philippe and Richard the Lionheart, they move on and they get to Constantinople, right? Kind of the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church and capital of the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire. They get there and they talk to the Emperor of Constantinople and they say, hey, you know what, we need some resources so we can continue on our journey and take back the Holy Land for Christians. Well, what happened was they're going to get their resources. There's an uprising. The king or the emperor that was going to give them the resources ends up getting overthrown or killed. So they don't get their resources. So instead of pushing on, they just decide, well, why don't we just take Constantinople for ourselves? Let's just take it and set up our own kingdoms there. And that's what they did. They set up these different empires and principalities, and they split it up for themselves. See, Constantinople's here. They just took it over. This, of course, Seljuk Turks here. That was Muslim rule. All right, we have something that may or may not have happened in 1212, and that's why I put a question mark by it. That'd be right in here somewhere. It was called the Children's Crusade. Interesting event. Whether it happened or not, I'm not sure. But the story is that there was a child, and Jesus told them to take other pure children and go to the Holy Land and convert Muslims to Christianity. And so then they go on this march from Western Europe on their way to the Holy Land, and they don't make it. Tens of thousands of children. They don't make it to the Holy Land. Some of them die of starvation. Some of them get sold into slavery. I remember reading one account that said they were trying to get a ship to take them the rest of the way. They were somewhere in the Mediterranean, and they pool their money. They pay the ship captain. But it turns out they're actually a band of slave raiders, and they take the children. They sell some of them into slavery. There's another slave ship full of children that were heading to the same fate, and that they ended up that ship ended up sinking, and they were killed. So whether this happened or not, regardless of that, Jerusalem and the Holy Land are controlled by the Muslims. Green, Muslim control. Red, Christian control. Right here is what's known as the Barons' Crusade. And what happened during the Barons' Crusade right here is you can see that they took back a lot of the Holy Land for Christianity. It was short-lived because eventually the Holy Land falls back into Muslim control, and it stays that way. You'll see that for quite a long time. I mean, it stays that way until after World War I. So we're talking, 1249 to 1917. That's a significant period of time. So what we see is that, and this is during the 14th century, so this is a map of Europe in the 1300s. What we see is that the Crusaders, at times weren't very successful at changing the picture, at least changing the picture permanently of the Holy Land, right? We still see that Muslims are in control of the Holy Land here in Constantinople, which later gets called Istanbul. And so the Crusades weren't always successful. The Crusader mentality was often successful. You had people going on these crusades who weren't soldiers. They were peasants, they were women, they were children, perhaps. And the idea was that, they're going to take back the Holy Land for Christians. And if you remember from the last video, some of them didn't even have to go all the way to the Holy Land. They're like, why are we going to go all the way to the Holy Land when we can stay right in our own neighborhood and kill Jews? Or we can go into Northern Europe and fight pagans, right? Kind of like leftovers, holdovers, these pagan religions that were around during the time of the Vikings, which wasn't very far from here. We're talking 100 years before all this happened. Or the Muslims were driven out of the Iberian Peninsula, what is present-day Spain and Portugal. This is Muslim territory right here, Granada. In 1492, they were completely pushed off the Iberian Peninsula. That's what's known as the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula. So that was successful to some degree, but all in all, it's really, really confusing as to watching Jerusalem go back and forth between these two different parties, the Christians and the Muslims. So green is Muslim control, red is Christian control. So there you have it. The Crusades, not all that successful, but at times very successful.